You walk into a store ready to buy a laptop and suddenly you are hit with a wall of numbers. Intel Core i7, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 SSD. The salesperson throws around terms like clock speed and solid state storage, and you nod politely while secretly wondering what any of it actually means for you. Here's the thing most people get wrong about laptop speed. They obsess over the processor. They ask, is it an i5 or an i7? They check the gigahertz rating like it's the only number that matters. But the reality is far more nuanced, and understanding it could save you hundreds of dollars while getting you a machine that actually performs better for your needs. And today we are breaking down the three components that truly determines how fast your laptop feels: the CPU, the RAM, and the SSD. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly which specs matter for the work you do and which ones are just marketing fluff designed to part you from your money. Let's start with the processor or CPU, since that's what everyone focuses on. The CPU is essentially the brain of your computer. It executes instructions, performs calculations, and manages everything that happens on your machine. When you open a program, edit a document, or just browsing through your website, your processor is doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. Processor speed is measured in gigahertz. A CPU running at 3.5 gigahertz can process 3.5 billion cycles per second. Sounds impressive, right? And generally speaking, a higher number does translate to faster performance. But here is where it gets really interesting. Clock speed alone doesn't tell the whole story. Two processors with identical gigahertz ratings can perform dramatically differently depending on their architecture, the number of cores they have, and how efficiently they handle instructions. A modern processor running at 3.0 gigahertz can actually outperform an older chip running at 4.0 gigahertz because of improvement in how the silicon is designed. Think of it like comparing car engines. A well-engineered V6 car can outperform a poorly designed V8. Even if the V8 has more raw displacement, the same principles applies to processors. Now, let's talk about cores. Each core in a processor is essentially its own mini processor capable of handling tasks independently. More cores mean your computer can juggle more operations simultaneously. Modern laptops typically have anywhere from 4 to 8 cores, with some high-end machines pushing even higher. There's also something called threads, which you will see on spec sheets. Some processors use a technology called simultaneous multithreading, or SMT, which allows each core to handle 2 tasks at once. So a 6-core processor with SMT will show up as having 12 threads. This effectively doubles the number of operations it can process simultaneously, which is particularly useful for tasks that can be parallelized. But here's the catch: not all software can take advantage of multiple cores. Many everyday applications, including most web browsers and basic productivity software, primarily rely on single-core performance. This is why gaming laptops often prioritize high clock speeds over core counts, because most games still run better on a few very fast cores rather than many slower ones. Modern processors also include something called cache, which is ultra-fast memory built directly into the chip. The cache stores frequently accessed data, so the CPU doesn't have to reach out to RAM constantly. Large cache size measured in megabytes can noticeably improve performance in certain workloads, though it's not something buyers need to obsess over. So what CPU do you actually need? For basic tasks like web browsing, email and documenting, editing, a mid-range processor like an Intel Core i5 or AMD Ryzen 5 is more than sufficient. You're looking at speeds between 2.5 and 3.5 gigahertz with 4 to 6 cores for gaming or creative work like video editing. Step up to an i7 or Ryzen 7 with speeds pushing 4.0 gigahertz or higher. Professional workloads involving 3D rendering or data analysis might warrant an i9 or Ryzen 9. But here is a critical point that most people miss. For the majority of users, the CPU is really the bottleneck. Your processor might be sitting there perfectly capable of handling whatever you throw at it, but other components are holding it back. And that brings us to the next piece of the puzzle: RAM, or random access memory. Is your computer's short-term memory. Unlike storage, which holds files permanently, RAM temporarily stores data that your processor needs to access quickly right now. When you launch a program, that program gets loaded from storage into RAM, so your CPU can work with it efficiently. Think of it like a desk workspace. Your hard drive is the filing cabinet across the room where you keep all your documents. But when you are actually working on something, you pull those documents onto your desk, which is your RAM. The bigger your desk, the more projects you can spread out and work on simultaneously without constantly walking back to the filing cabinet. The speed of RAM is incredibly fast compared to any storage device. We're talking about data transfer rates measured in gigabytes per second with near instantaneous latency. This is precisely why your computer loads programs into RAM rather than running them directly from storage. It will simply be too slow otherwise. Now, here's where RAM becomes absolutely critical for everyday performance. When your computer runs out of RAM, it starts using your storage drive as overflow memory, a process called memory swapping, and even the fastest storage drive is dramatically slower than RAM. We're talking about a difference of orders of magnitude here. When your system starts swapping, everything grinds to a crawl. This is why a laptop with a modest processor but adequate RAM often feels snappier than one with a powerful CPU but insufficient memory. You can have the most sophisticated brain in the world, but if your short-term memory can only hold 3 things at once, you are going to struggle. So how much RAM do you actually need? In 2025, 8GB is the absolute minimum, and honestly, it's getting tight. Modern operating systems are memory hungry, and applications keep demanding more and more. Windows alone will eat up 4 to 5GB just sitting idle. Open a few Chrome tabs and you've already consumed most of your available memory. For most people, 16GB is the sweet spot. It gives you comfortable headroom for multitasking, running multiple browser tabs, working with productivity software, and even some light photo editing or gaming. This is where I recommend most buyers land. 32GB starts making sense if you are doing video editing, working with large data sets, running virtual machines, or streaming while gaming. Professionals working with 4K video footage, 3D modeling, or heavy database work might even need 64GB. One crucial consideration: many modern laptops have RAM soldered directly to the motherboard, meaning you can't upgrade it later. If you are buying a laptop that doesn't allow RAM upgrade, buy more than you think you need right now. Software requirements only go up over time, never down. Getting 16GB now instead of 6 could extend your laptop's useful life by 2 or 3 years. There's also RAM speed to consider, measured in megahertz. Faster RAM means data transfer between memory and processor. DDR4 running at 3200 MHz is common, while DDR5 pushes even higher. However, for most users, RAM capacity matters far more than RAM speed. Having enough memory will always beat having fast but insufficient memory. Now, we arrive at what might be the single most impactful component for perceived laptop speed: the SSD, or solid state drive. This is your long-term storage where all your files, programs, and operating systems live, and the type of storage you have makes an enormous difference in how fast your laptop feels. For years, computers use traditional hard disk drives or HDDs. These have spinning magnetic platters and mechanical read and write heads that physically move to access data. They are cheap and offer lots of storage, but they are slow. A typical HDD tops out around 160 MB per second, and because of that mechanical movement, there is inherent latency every time you access data. SSDs change everything. They use flash memory with no moving part. Data access is nearly instantaneous because there is nothing mechanical to wait for. A basic SATA SSD delivers around 550 MB per second. That's more than 3 times faster than an HDD. But NVMe SSDs, which connect directly through the PCIe interface, can hit speeds of 3500 MB per second on older drives and up to 7500 MB per second on the latest models. The real-world impact is dramatic. A laptop with an HDD might take 90 seconds to boot Windows. Put an SSD in that same machine and you are looking at 20 seconds. Some systems boot in under 10 seconds. Applications that took 30 seconds to launch open in 3 seconds. File transfers that drag on for minutes complete in seconds. This is why I argue that for most users, storage is actually the component that matters most for everyday speed perception. You can have the most powerful processor and tons of RAM, but if your laptop is still running on an old hard drive, it's going to feel sluggish. Conversely, even a budget laptop with a decent SSD will feel remarkably responsive during normal use. Now, what about NVMe versus SATA? Here's an honest assessment. For everyday tasks like web browsing, document editing, and even gaming, the difference between a SATA SSD and an NVMe drive isn't as dramatic as you might expect. Boot times might differ by a few seconds. Games load a bit faster but play at the same frame rate. Most applications open so quickly on either that the difference is barely perceptible. Where NVMe really shines is in sustained heavy workloads. Copying large files, video editing with high resolution footage, compiling code, running databases. these stacks see massive improvement from NVMe's higher bandwidth. If you are doing professional creative work, NVMe is worth the premium. For general use, a good SATA SSD does the job beautifully at a lower price. There is another advantage to SSDs beyond raw speed: durability. With no moving parts, they are far more resistant to physical shock. For laptop users, this matters a lot. Drop a laptop with an HDD while it's running and you risk catastrophic data loss. SSDs shock off bombs and movement without issue. They also use less power, extending battery life and generates less heat, which helps your system run cooler, quieter. Understanding how these components interact is crucial for making smart purchasing decisions. They form a pipeline and your system is only as fast as the slowest link in that chain. When you launch an application, here's what happens. The CPU tells the storage to load the program. Data moves from the SSD into RAM, where the CPU can access it quickly and execute instructions. The CPU processes that data, sends results back to RAM, and eventually writes changes back to storage. If any part of this pipeline bottlenecks, the whole system slows down. A blazing fast CPU waiting on a slow hard drive is like a Formula 1 engine connected to bicycle wheels. All that processing power sits idle while data trickles in. Similarly, insufficient RAM creates a bottleneck. When memory fills up, the system must swap data to storage, and suddenly even an NVMe drive becomes the limiting factor because it's orders of magnitude slower than RAM. Your powerful CPU sits there waiting while data shuffles back and forth. The key insight is balance. A system with a mid-range CPU, 16GB of RAM, and an SSD will dramatically outperform one with a high-end CPU, 8GB of RAM, and an HDD, even if the second system costs more. Components need to complement each other. So let's translate all this into practical advice based on what you actually do with your computer. For basic users, you browse the web, check email, watch videos, work with documents, and maybe do some light photo editing. Here's what you need: any modern quad-core processor running at 2.5 GHz or higher, 8GB of RAM minimum, but preferably 16, and at least 256GB SSD. Don't waste money on a powerful CPU here. A Core i3 or Ryzen 3 with good RAM and an SSD would feel perfectly snappy. For students and office professionals, you are multitasking heavily, running video calls, working with spreadsheets and presentations, and keeping dozens of browser tabs open. Step up to a Core i5 or Ryzen 5 with 16GB of RAM and a 512GB SSD. The extra RAM is crucial for multitasking, and the larger SSD ensures you won't run out of space halfway through the semester or quarter. For gamers, gaming performance depends heavily on your GPU, but the CPU and storage matter too. Look for a Core i7 or Ryzen 7 with strong single-thread performance, 16GB of RAM, and an NVMe SSD. The fast storage dramatically reduces level loading times, and modern games increasingly benefit from the extra CPU headroom. For content creators, video editors, graphic designers, 3D artists, and photographers, this is where you want power across the board. Core i7 or Ryzen 7, minimum 32GB of RAM and a fast NVMe SSD with at least 1TB of capacity. Video editing especially benefits from RAM and fast storage. Timeline scrubbing, rendering previews, and exporting all improve dramatically with better specs in these areas. For developers and data professionals running virtual machines, compiling code, or processing large datasets, you need high core count processors, 32 to 64GB of RAM, and NVMe storage. Compiling a large project can use every bit of CPU power and RAM you have, and fast storage speeds up build times significantly. So how do you know what's making your current laptop slow? You need to find the bottleneck. If you are on Windows, hit Ctrl+Shift plus Escape, or if you are using Mac, open the Spotlight search and search for Activity Monitor. Look at the Performance tab. If CPU is at 100% RAM low, you need a faster processor. You are likely doing heavy math, video encoding, or gaming. RAM at 90% plus, CPU is low. You don't need a new laptop, you just need more RAM if it's upgradable. This is the too many tabs syndrome. Disk at 100%. If you see this and you have an old HDD, replacing it with a $50 SSD would make your laptop feel 5 years younger. If you already have an SSD and it's at 100%, you might have a failing drive or a virus. If you already have a laptop that feels slow, here's how to prioritize upgrade based on your symptoms. If your laptop takes forever to boot, applications are slow to launch, and file operations drag on, your storage is the culprit. Swapping an old HDD for an SSD SSD is the single most transformative upgrade you can make. I've seen machines that felt ready for the recycling bin become responsive and pleasant to use after an SSD upgrade. If your laptop slows down when you have multiple programs open, if the fan kicks into overdrive when you are just browsing with a few tabs, if Task Manager shows your memory constantly near capacity, you will need more RAM. Upgrading from 8 to 16 gigabytes can feel like getting a new computer. If your laptop struggles with specific demanding tasks like gaming, video rendering, complex calculations, despite having adequate RAM and SSD, then and only then is the CPU your bottleneck. Unfortunately, laptop processors generally aren't upgradable. This is where you are looking at a new machine. For most people with older laptops, upgrading storage first, then RAM will provide the biggest improvement for the least money. I've personally upgraded laptops for friends who were convinced they needed new machines. A $50 SSD and an afternoon of work gave them another 3-4 years of productive use. So before we wrap up, let me address some persistent myths I hear all the time. Myth number 1, more gigahertz always means a faster computer. Reality, architecture matters more than raw clock speed. A modern 3.0 gigahertz processor will often outperform an older 4.0 gigahertz chip. Compare processors within the same generations and from reputable benchmarks, not just by their gigahertz number. Myth number 2, 16 gigabytes of RAM is overkill. Reality is, maybe 3 years ago, today 16 is the comfortable minimum for anyone doing more than the absolute basics. With many laptops having non-upgradable RAM, what seems like overkill today becomes just right tomorrow. Myth number 3, my fast SSD means I don't need much RAM. Reality is, even the fastest SSD is still orders of magnitude slower than RAM. When your system swaps to disk because RAM is full, you will feel it. Fast storage doesn't compensate for insufficient memory. Myth number 4, I can just upgrade later. Reality is, many modern laptops have soldered RAM and storage that can't be upgraded. Always check upgradability before purchasing. And if components are fixed, buy what you will need for the laptop's entire lifespan. Next time you are shopping for a laptop, don't get seduced by the biggest CPU number on the spec sheet. Look at the whole picture. Make sure it has an SSD, not an HDD. Confirm there is enough RAM for your workload and consider whether you can upgrade it later. Then pick a CPU appropriate for your use case. A balanced system will always outperform an unbalanced one, regardless of how impressive any single spec looks on paper. Spend your money where it matters and you will end up with a laptop that actually feels fast, not just one that looks fast in a benchmark. Thanks for watching. If this helped you understand laptop specs a little better, hit that like button and subscribe for more no-nonsense tech explanations. And drop a comment below telling me what component you think is most important for your workflow.